Ben Simmons is one of the biggest busts in recent NBA history, but just because he's a bust doesn't mean he doesn't belong in the league. Let's talk about that. What's going on, guys? I'm Floater Alert, and we're gonna look into the gameplay of Ben Simmons this year and see if he might just be turning it around a little bit. Now, it's clear he isn't the same player that he was in Philadelphia, and we'll talk about that, but let's look at what he's been doing this year. So far, Ben has been averaging about 6, 6, and 7 on a career-high true shooting percentage. He's been putting up about 1.5 stocks per game, that is steals plus blocks combined. His PER and value over replacement player are both down on the year, but they're still somewhat average for the rest of the league. And his on-off stats actually back him up pretty well, with the Nets offense being about 1.1 points better per 100 possessions and nearly 4 points better on defense per 100 possessions, giving him a net on-off +5, which is actually pretty good, especially given that the Nets have not been that good this year and they've been dealing with quite a few injuries. But as someone like Ben Simmons who has struggled so much for his career, he can't stay healthy, he can't stay on the court, he's been having those kind of mental issues and he's had that game disappear from him. Should he still be in the league? Let's jump into the film and see where he is right now and what potential he could have for the Nets for the rest of the season or for a new team next year. So when it comes to Simmons, the things that you can say about him are things that have rang true for his entire career. His skill set has not grown much, but the skill set that he is still elite at is still something that carries over very well in Brooklyn. He does great in transition, both passing and actually finishing. He's finishing at the hoop pretty well this year, and he's actually finishing at up to 10 feet at the highest rate of his career. Albeit this isn't anything insane, especially compared to the rest of the league, but by Ben Simmons standards, he has actually widened his range by a little bit, even if he's only shooting 50% from the line and hasn't attempted a three-pointer. But outside of doing really well in transition and finishing well at the basket, he's also been seeing some levels of success in the Nets half-court offense. He does a great job at doing handoffs. He's generally a pretty good pick and roll man, although I do think he could be a little bit better at this. He has a really good two-man game with guys like Cameron Johnson and Cameron Thomas, especially Cameron Johnson when he is going off and proving himself as that 3-level scorer that I've talked about him being before. He and Ben Simmons actually look like a pretty good duo together. Ben Simmons also plays the dunker spot position pretty well. This is where he's usually on the opposite side of the hoop, opposite of where the ball is at least, and he's in that perfect position to receive a dump-off pass or for a lob. Now, we've seen him in this position for the majority of his career. We saw it a lot back in Philadelphia, and it is something that I rag on Simmons for a lot because it is something that slows down the offense. It absolutely kills the spacing, especially when he's on the floor with someone like Nick Claxton. But Simmons also does a really good job at receiving passes, going right back up with it, and recently in games, he's been doing a really good job actually at throwing down lobs, surprisingly, off of it, which it actually took Ben Simmons a long time to this year. It took over like 10 games, I think, for him to actually start dunking the ball, but we've been starting to see that side of him come out a little bit more. And that aggressiveness in him has also been coming out as the season goes on. And it's not just the way that he sometimes stares down another player after a hoop, but it's the way that he's been attacking the basket and actually throwing down a dunk like a 6'10" player should, instead of just laying it in. Look no more against the game against the Phoenix Suns, where Ben Simmons had some of the first points of the game, and he was actually leading the Brooklyn Nets in scoring for like the entire first half. For Simmons, a guy who's been extremely passive, especially in the latter half of his career, this is a huge mark that you want to see on him, and it shows that when he is being aggressive, there is still something there and there is still something to build a team around. And then defensively, of course, it's Ben Simmons. He guards the 1 through 5 really well. He can block shots really well. He stays in front of his man really well. He has really good hands, which can cause a lot of strips, a lot of steals, and just generally kind of throw things off in the offense, and that throws it back into that transition game where I've already talked about. Sometimes in transition, I think he actually looks for the pass a little bit too much, and there is that little Giannis style that he could be playing a little bit more. But I also like how he doesn't just barrel his head down and drive towards the hoop. He does a good job in getting his teammates involved. And despite all the injuries and all the time off and just everything that we've seen from Simmons, he is still athletic. He may not be an absolute physical freak, but he can still dunk, he is still pretty strong, and he is still pretty quick, especially at his size. But Everything that I've said is stuff that we expect to see from Ben Simmons. I'm not really saying anything that's new, and this is still the same type of game that we've seen from him back when he was in Philadelphia. And just like in Philadelphia, we are seeing the exact same issues from Simmons. Of course, there's his spacing, and I don't even really want to jump into this because it's Ben Simmons. We know he's not going to space out the floor. We know he's not going to shoot from beyond 10 feet. And I'm not even going to lean into that, but there are still guys, Rudy Gobert is an example, there are still guys who play in the NBA and can play at a higher level even though they can't space out the floor, and Ben Simmons I think can be a part of that. As I mentioned earlier, Ben does a great job in being in the dunker spot, but this is also a pretty old style. It's not something that we really see anymore, especially with things like 5-out offenses being more common, and we see the Brooklyn Nets often run a 5-out offense when Ben isn't on the floor. I mentioned it earlier, but Ben does pretty well as a roll man or as a guy setting a screen, as a guy in a handoff, something like that, but there are definitely times where he could be better. I think he could be a little more physical, and I think he could be playing that center role a little bit more in the half court when the Nets offense is calling for it. And then outside of that with Simmons, another big drawback that is kind of touched upon, but it's the fact that you need a whole team built around him. Now this can be both a pro and a con, but a con to it is the fact that he is already on one of the better built teams around him. The Brooklyn Nets are a top 5 3-point shooting team in the league when it comes from both a volume and a percentage converted standpoint, so you can't really put a whole lot more floor spacers around Ben. While he's listed as a point guard, he is often the tallest one on the floor. He often is at the dunker spot, setting screens, or he's guarding the other team center, so in reality he actually does play a lot more like a center, at least on certain rotations. So for me, when I'm looking at Ben Simmons and I'm trying to evaluate him and I'm trying to see if he's even going to be an NBA player next year, I'm not looking at him in the context of a point guard. I'm looking at him closer as you would see him as a center, and I want to judge him in the role that you would see a passing point forward, someone like Draymond Green or a Nikola Jokic without the spacing or the scoring ability. But based on what we have seen so far from Simmons, I still like him as a basketball player. Now he is so clearly not what he was in Philadelphia. His stats have fallen off so much. It's not just his stats in the total game, it's his per 36, it's his advanced stats, it's his per 100 possession stats. Ben is just not the same player that he was. He wasn't the player that he was destined to be, and I'm not expecting him to be that anymore. It doesn't matter how many times we see something in the offseason of him hitting free throws, hitting three-pointers, being all aggressive. I don't expect that to change anytime soon. I fully believe that if Ben started shooting three-pointers, even if he didn't make them very much, even if he made them at a Russell Westbrook type rate, if Ben was shooting three-pointers, I think he would still be a better player than what he was now. And even maybe just seeing the ball go in, maybe that would help him out a little bit. But Ben is just one of those rare cases of somebody flat out refusing to shoot. We've seen him do in the offseason, so we know it's possible for the ball to go in. But the fact that he just doesn't shoot, there aren't a lot of players like that in NBA history. But my point is, this is the max level Ben that we are going to see. And this is probably the player that he is going to be for the rest of his career. Now, his career is either going to be the rest of this year or a few more years. Personally, I think he still has quite a few more years in the NBA, and I think in the right circumstances, he can still be someone who is effective for the right NBA team. Ben needs to be on the right NBA team that suffers defensively and could use him both as a defender and as a passer. That team also has to be able to space out the floor and have a lot of shooters to hide his lack of shooting. By this point, Ben Simmons hasn't really been playing at a true above average level, and he's barely been at that starter level for his season so far, and I think him coming off of the bench for a contender is probably the best possible scenario for him. I imagine Ben Simmons more as a 7th or 8th man on an NBA bench. I think he can play that unique role of being that backup point guard that plays the center position. Let's say you're a team and you're not really concerned about the other team center bullying over you, then playing Ben Simmons as the tallest man on the court, it gives you that edge in transition, it gives you that playmaking edge, and if you use him in the half court correctly, you still have an incredible NBA player. Okay, maybe not incredible, but you still have a pretty solid NBA player, definitely someone who deserves to be in the league. Now, I do think a lot of this also comes down to coaching and how coaches use Ben. Don't have him just sitting at the dunker spot, give him the ball, have him setting screens, have him be actively moving in the offense, maybe give him that little short hop pass and find the open man. That's the most effective way to use Simmons, not just plugging him next to the hoop, waiting for that dump off pass. Some of the best possessions that Brooklyn has had this year are the ones where Simmons is actively doing just something. Just something is all I want to see him doing, just not sitting next to the hoop. But everything I've said is on one stipulation, and that's because he needs to remain healthy. If Simmons suffers another sort of long injury that is gonna take him out for the rest of the season, I think he's done. He missed a lot of the last few seasons and he has barely played that many minutes in Brooklyn. It seems like Ben Simmons getting injured and missing a significant amount of time is just a matter of when and not if. As someone who believes in Ben Simmons, even when I probably shouldn't be, if Ben Simmons gets injured and misses a lot of the season this year, he's done. It's time to hang it up, and I wouldn't want another team to touch him. But if Ben Simmons can make it through, and right now he's on pace to play almost 75% of all games, that's enough to actually be eligible for awards, and it's more than Joel Embiid. But if Ben Simmons actually plays enough and makes it through the season, I would not expect him to remain in Brooklyn, even though it's a pretty good situation for him. I think he's still better suited to play on a contender. I can see Ben Simmons finding the right role in the NBA. Philadelphia was his prime, Brooklyn was his bounce back, and I think next season he can prove himself as a really solid player to come off of the bench. Just because a player comes off the bench doesn't mean that they aren't filling their role and they aren't filling it well. And that's what I want to see Simmons in. Not in a position where if the lights are too bright, the whole team crumbles. Not if he fails to show up again in the playoffs, you lose your whole season. A guy that can come in, he can play really well for you, but if he doesn't play well for you, you take him out. If he has a bad matchup, you don't play him and your team isn't hurt. That is the role that I want to see Ben Simmons in. Of course, that isn't the role that we envisioned for the #1 overall pick out of LSU. That's not what 76ers thought that they were getting however many years ago, but this is the guy who is in front of us now. Just because Ben Simmons is a bust doesn't mean that a healthy Ben Simmons should not be in the NBA. So if Ben Simmons stays healthy and if he gets off the worst contract, or maybe the second worst contract that we have seen in recent NBA history, I fully think that we could see him being a valuable player coming off of the bench for a championship level team.